wasn't looking for a disappeared village. I was going through regional census records from the 1870s, a particular county's worth of household tallies and land assessments, the kind of dry administrative material that rewards patience with occasional unexpected detail, trying to understand population patterns in a rural district that later became heavily industrialized. These records are meticulous in the way that 19th century administrative documents often were. Each household head named, each farm assessed, each business establishment noted. The enumerators who walked these routes and recorded these names were doing their jobs carefully, and the documents they produced reflect that care. And there, in the 1875 enumeration, was a settlement. Named, populated. 43 households, which implies somewhere between 150 and 200 people depending on household composition. Farms listed with acreage and assessed values. A mill recorded as an operating business. A church, registered in the county's denominational records, with a named congregation. A postmaster appointed and recorded with the Federal Postal Service in 1872, which means someone in Washington had formally recognized this community as substantial enough to warrant its own mail distribution. A settlement that, in every measurable administrative sense, existed completely. The 1880 census doesn't list it. The name doesn't appear anywhere in the county's enumeration. The households don't reappear under different headings or alternative spellings. The land parcels that were individually assessed in 1875 show up in 1880 under a single consolidated entry with no occupant. Classified, without explanation, as unimproved agricultural land. No forwarding addresses, no death records for 150 people who should have left some mortality trace somewhere if they died during a 5-year period. No migration records showing 40-odd families arriving anywhere else. No church transfer records, which were standard procedure when a congregation dissolved or relocated. No school enrollment transfers showing children appearing in neighboring districts. No land sale records, which would have been legally required if 43 households had sold their properties and moved on. They didn't sell. They didn't die. They didn't move anywhere that left a record. Between the summer of 1875 and the spring of 1880, when the next census was conducted, they simply stopped appearing. Not coincidence, not administrative error. A census district doesn't miscategorize 43 households as empty farmland. Not a collective migration that left no documentation in any receiving community. Something happened to these people that the record system surrounding them either couldn't capture or was arranged not to capture. And this settlement is not unique. This is what I found when I started pulling on the thread. The 1870s and 1880s contain a disproportionate number of these vanishing communities, when you compare the population records carefully. Small settlements, rarely large enough to be incorporated towns, usually organized around a mill or a farm cluster, or a particular piece of productive land, that appear in mid-decade records and are absent by the next enumeration without the kind of paper trail that population movement always produces. Estate sales when families die. School transfers when children move. Church letters when congregants relocate to a new parish. Newspaper announcements when a business closes. The normal residue of human community, which is extensive and persistent, simply doesn't appear for these settlements. They existed, and then they stopped existing. And the machinery of documentation that should have recorded their ending didn't. Consider what it actually takes for 150 people to disappear without leaving records. Not to die. Mass death produces its own extensive documentation. Medical reports, burial records, coroner's inquiries, newspaper coverage, public health responses, property inheritance proceedings. Mass death in a 19th century rural community would have been noticed by surrounding communities, reported to county authorities, and investigated at minimum by whoever had financial interest in the land and properties involved. None of that documentation exists for these vanished settlements. They didn't die in any way the record system recognized. Consider what it takes for 150 people to relocate. Land transfer records, transport records if they traveled by rail, new addresses in receiving communities, children appearing in new schools, adults appearing in new church rolls. The machinery of community membership that any 19th century person leaving one settlement and joining another would have generated. That machinery generated nothing. They didn't move in any way the record system recognized either. Here's the thing about the 1879 settlement specifically. The postal records are the most precise evidence we have for its existence, because the Federal Postal Service maintained meticulous records of appointed postmasters and active post offices as a matter of operational necessity. Routes and accounts depended on knowing exactly which offices were active and which weren't. The postmaster for this settlement was appointed in 1872. His appointment is in the federal record, with his name, the date, and the county designation. There's no record of his removal from the position, no resignation, no death record for him anywhere in the state's vital records, no transfer to another postmaster appointment elsewhere. Post offices weren't simply abandoned when communities dispersed. There was a formal administrative procedure for closing an office, involving notification up the postal hierarchy, reassignment of routes, reconciliation of accounts. That procedure generated paperwork. For every properly closed post office in this period, there's a paper trail. For this, Settlement's Post Office, there is no closure record anywhere in the Federal Postal Archives. The office appears in active listings in 1878. It doesn't appear in 1880. What happened between those 2 points? What event prompted the office to stop functioning? Who decided not to file the closure paperwork? Where the appointed postmaster went? Is simply absent from the record. Not filed under the wrong category. Not awaiting digitization in an obscure repository. Absent. The land classification change is perhaps the strangest single element. When 43 assessed farm properties appear in an 1880 land record as a single unimproved parcel, someone made that reclassification. Someone with access to the county assessor's records, with authority to modify them, looked at 43 separate inhabited farm entries and changed them to one uninhabited agricultural tract. That's not a passive omission. That's an active administrative decision. Someone knew the settlement was gone and made a bureaucratic determination about how to handle its land, and whoever made that determination left no explanation in the record, no notation about why the reclassification occurred, no reference to any event that prompted it, no documentation of what had happened to the people whose farms these had been. They simply reclassified the land and moved on, as if the settlement's disappearance required neither explanation nor inquiry. The pattern across similar cases from the same decade suggests something coordinated in its effect, if not necessarily in its origin. Not coordinated in the sense of a single authority directing events. I want to be precise about what I'm claiming here and what I'm not, but coordinated in the sense that the administrative response to these disappearances follows strikingly similar logic across different jurisdictions, different states, different levels of record keeping. The settlements vanish. The land is quietly reclassified. The demographic absence is absorbed into the surrounding record without comment, without inquiry, without the ordinary mechanisms of social concern that would normally activate when a community of 150 people ceased to exist. Regional newspapers, which in the 1870s were often meticulous and even gossipy about local events within their circulation area, don't report on communities that have ceased to exist within their coverage territory. Neighboring settlements don't produce accounts of what happened next door. County courts don't show the inheritance proceedings that should have followed mass death or mass abandonment of property. The silence is remarkably complete, and silence about something genuinely unexpected in a record system that otherwise documented the most routine aspects of rural life in exhaustive detail requires either that these disappearances were somehow expected by the people doing the documenting, which raises its own set of questions, or that those responsible for documentation reached an implicit agreement to absorb the absence without asking what produced it. What were these settlements? That question matters. And the answer in the physical evidence remaining at some sites is suggestive in ways that the census documents didn't prepare me for. In at least some cases, where the location of a vanished settlement is identifiable and has been examined by people willing to dig, sometimes literally, what's found at the surface or just beneath it doesn't quite match what was described in the administrative records. The 1875 enumeration lists 43 farm households. That implies wooden structures, the kind of vernacular construction typical of rural 19th century settlements in that region: timber frames, board siding, the modest, permanent architecture that surveyors would have seen and recorded without particular comment. But the land, in locations where substantial later development hasn't obscured the physical record, sometimes shows foundation evidence inconsistent with that description. Stonework at depths suggesting permanent foundations, built for structures considerably heavier and more substantial than wooden farm buildings. Cellar configurations suggesting buildings with complex underground levels, storage or habitation spaces carved out below the frost line with evident skill and deliberate planning. Infrastructure. Evidence of drainage channels, leveled pad sites, grade modifications. That implies either the settlement itself was something different from what the census records categorized it as, or the settlement was established on top of something older that the census records didn't acknowledge, because the enumerators either didn't notice it or didn't have a category for it. That last possibility keeps returning. What if these 43 households were not the original occupancy of that land? What if they were living in and around an existing built environment? Structures and infrastructure they found, rather than built, which the census enumerated as their own construction, because the enumerators recorded what the residents told them. And what if the disappearance was connected not to anything about those specific households, but to something about the site they occupied? The Tartarian framework gives this a coherent shape. An earlier civilization built across the landscape at a scale and with a permanence that left physical traces: foundations, cellars, infrastructure now buried or partially buried below later settlement. When new communities established themselves in the post-reset period of the 19th century, they often settled on existing built sites because existing built sites offered obvious advantages: cleared ground, available stone, existing water management, protection from elements. They occupied the remains without necessarily understanding what they were occupying. And in some cases, the erasure that had partially cleared these sites the first time was not finished. It came back. It completed what had been started, and 150 people, living on a site that had already been erased once, were erased again. The record machinery around them noted the absence and, in the particular silence that characterizes every similar case from this period, agreed collectively not to pursue what it meant: the name of the settlement, the county, the state. I'm deliberately not specifying these, and I want to be direct about why. Not because the records don't exist. They do. Not because I'm uncertain about what I found. I'm not. But because in every case where researchers have tried to publicize specific locations and precise record citations for these vanished communities, the records in question have subsequently become difficult to access: archival reorganizations that moved relevant holdings to different repositories, transfer of records to collections with restricted access requiring institutional affiliation, digitization, projects covering the relevant counties and decades that somehow omit the specific years or administrative categories where the disappearances are documented. The access problems may be coincidental. Institutional archiving is genuinely underfunded and inconsistent, and gaps appear in digitization projects for reasons that have nothing to do with deliberate restriction. I understand that. But the pattern of inaccessibility, clustering specifically around documents that name specific vanished settlements in multiple independent archives across several states, is pronounced enough to notice, distinct enough from the general noise of archival inconsistency to feel like something other than bad luck. What I can tell you is that if you look, patiently and carefully, in the regional census records of the 1870s and 1880s, in the postal appointment and abolishment records of the same period, in the land assessment records that show property reclassification without explanation. You will find them, not one isolated case, but many, a systematic pattern of community disappearance across a particular decade, concentrated in the years immediately surrounding 1879, that the official historical record of the period has never acknowledged, never explained, and never, as far as I can determine, seriously tried to understand. They were there, and then they were not, and the record system surrounding them noted their absence with a consistency of silence that feels, when you've read enough of it, less like administrative neglect and more like collective decision.